and betrayed a considerable and rather dangerous desire to jerk me from my seat. The rhythm of the music, which had seemed so unnatural at first, began to exert its influence over me. It wasn't that feeling of ease in the joints of the feet and the toes, which might be caused by a Strauss waltz. No, it was much more energetic, material, independent, as though one had encountered a balking horse, which is absolutely impossible to master. So there was this great sense of the syncopation there in ragtime. And the greatest of the composers of ragtime was Scott Joplin, who was born in 1868 in Texarkana, right at the Arkansas-Texas border. His father was a very good violinist. His mother played banjo and they sang. He had two older brothers and sisters who would also join the family in singing. And his mother was actually kind of a laundress for the white homes there, and happened to meet up and find a wonderful German Jewish immigrant named Julius Weiss, who heard young Scott Joplin play when he was 7 or 8 years old, and he offered to give free lessons to this kid because he realized there was something special about him. Now, ultimately, his mother would die when he was 13 years old. His father told him he really needed to get a real job, but Scott wanted to do music, so he actually left home and began touring all around to St. Louis and along the Mississippi, just playing and listening to this new ragtime music that was coming to the fore. He ends up at the Chicago Exposition in 1893, which is really the place that is credited with spreading the beginning of that ragtime music. And then he makes his way to Sedalia, Missouri in 1894 and starts playing for the Maple Leaf Club there in Sedalia. He also was able to attend a college there, the George Smith College, which allowed him to get a little bit of training, a serious training in theory. He ultimately writes the Maple Leaf Rag in 1899. He knew that was a great piece. He said, "The Maple Leaf will one day make me king of ragtime composers," and indeed it did. But he had a difficult life. He ended up marrying a woman named Belle Hayden in 1901. They would actually move to St. Louis the next year, and our first piece we're playing, the Palm Leaf Rag, was written shortly after they got to St. Louis. They had one daughter together, but unfortunately she died of meningitis before she was a year old, and Joplin, who of course grew up in these saloons and really the brothels of the lower end, ended up getting syphilis in that same year, and he began to lose motor control in his hands. And there was I think he was in a severe depression. They break up the marriage, and sadly, he would write this fantastic opera named Tremonisha, which never was actually produced until 1972, many years after he had died. And he knew that his music was going to be ahead of its time. He said once, when I'm dead 25 years, people are going to begin to recognize me. And indeed, it was 25 years after he died that Rudy Blesch wrote the first big book on ragtime. Ragtime kind of got forgotten in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, but it really was that first step towards the music we're going to play. Now, ragtime did scare a lot of the white people that listened to it, especially as it moved into New York. And there are some rather humorous, although true, articles written about ragtime. This is from the Musical America in 1917. "The counters of our music stores are now loaded with this virulent poison, which in the form of a malarious epidemic is finding its way into the homes and brains of our youth to such an extent as to arouse one's suspicions of their sanity. This is an evil music that has crept into the hearts of our American people and must be wiped out like other bad and dangerous epidemics have been exterminated. A person once inoculated with the ragtime fever is like one addicted to strong drink. Ragtime is syncopation gone mad, and its victims, in my opinion, can only be treated successfully like a dog with rabies." So there was this real sense, and much the same with rock and roll and with rap, that this music was going to rot away the brains of our youth. And of course, there was a lot of racial overtones to that. There was one famous composer who loved ragtime. That was the Russian composer Igor Stravinsky. And he told the New York Tribune in 1919, "I don't know much about American music except that of ragtime, but I consider that music unrivaled. It is veritable art, and I can never get enough of it to satisfy me. I am convinced of the absolute truth of utterance in that form of American art. And then he went on to say, God forbid that you Americans should ever compose symphonies or fugues, which is not very nice. But he did recognize the real greatness of this music. So we're going to play the Palm Leaf Rag from 1903, and then we'll play a rag that you will recognize, The Entertainer. This was the theme music to The Sting, which was that movie that came out in 1973, which really helped repopularize this ragtime music. Here's two rags by Scott Joplin. Thank you. All right, so that was the music that was coming from the South into New York and into the urban areas in the North. Meanwhile, there was a huge influx of Jewish immigrants, Eastern European immigrants, coming over from Russia and Eastern Europe, escaping pogroms there as there were crackdowns on Jews over there. And from 1880 to 1920, essentially 1/3 of the Jewish population of Eastern Europe ended up coming over to New York. And many of them were musicians. And the musicians there were called Klezmer, or Klezmorim, which really means a vessel of song. Then Klezmer were just these groups that would often, music was often illegal in those areas. So Klezmer musicians had to be very mobile, which is why the piano was not really a Klezmer instrument, because it's hard to carry that and run from the authorities. But the clarinet and violin and accordion, they were the major instruments. Many of these great musicians came over, and as they started to perform in New York and heard some of that ragtime music as well, there was a wonderful blending of these scales, because in many ways the kind of blues scale and then the Jewish scale are very similar in many ways. And so there was this sense of sort of coming together of oppressed peoples sort of finding a way, and there was this blurring. The reason I have the title of Jewish Jazz, I actually came across an article, and the title of the article was Jewish Jazz Becomes Our National Music. And I said, oh, that's interesting. That's really cool. Let me see who wrote it. Well, it happened to be written by Henry Ford, a very noted anti-Semite. In the Dearborn Independent, and he was not happy about Jewish jazz, as I found out later, but he was actually making a fairly good point in one sense, that there was this real link between the Jewish people and the African Americans there, but this is how Henry Ford described it. He said, "Many people have wondered whence come the waves upon waves of musical slush that invade our decent parlors and set the young people of this generation imitating the drivel of morons. A clue to the answer is in the above clipping. Popular music is a Jewish monopoly. Jazz is a Jewish creation. The mush, the slush, the sly suggestion, the abandoned sensuousness of sliding notes are all of Jewish origin." And there is indeed this sense of sort of the moving, the expressiveness that Steve will talk about at the beginning of the second half that was part of Klezmer did get enveloped into jazz. Now, obviously, it's not a Jewish creation, but there was this real intermingling that was interesting. Now, Henry Ford went on to say, he said, talking about Tin Pan Alley, where all the great songs were being written, mostly by Jewish folks at the time, he said, "Tin Pan Alley is the name given to the region in 28th Street, between Broadway and 6th Avenue, where the first Yiddish song manufacturers began business. Flocks of young girls who thought they could sing and others who thought they could write song poems came to the neighborhood, allured by dishonest advertisements that promised more than the budding Yiddish exploiters were able to fulfill. Needless to say, scandal became rampant, as it always does when so-called Gentile girls are reduced to the necessity of seeking favors from the Jew." So this is fairly horrifying stuff, but was a fairly common thought that there was this real connection here between the Jews. But the Jewish music that was coming out, what we now call this sort of klezmer music, began to sort of spring up there in New York. We're going to play a piece that was actually written many years later, I think in 2008, by an Italian clarinetist named Michel Magnani. This is his Jewish suite that he wrote in 4 short movements, which sort of gives that basis of that kind of music, leading from a sort of a slower beginning to a really fun, fast ending. And you get the sense of that uncontrollable joy that's also fused with a kind of irrevocable pathos, the tears of a clown that comes into a lot of this Jewish music. Here is the Jewish Suite by Michel Magnani.